plagues and pandemics and its impact on civilizations. My name's Rehan Khan and I'm your moderator for today. Over the last 12 months we've seen a number of different shocking events around the world, and we've been witnessing things which we've only really read about in the history books before. So to help us really try and make sense of what's actually happening to some extent, we have with us two very special guests. We have Bettany Hughes, who's on the line with us. She's an award-winning historian, and she's presented a number of different television programs, written a number of books, and she's joining us on the line over Zoom. And I'll go to her in just a minute. And obviously on stage here we have Peter Hellier, who's an advisor to the Ministry of Culture. He's written and edited about 20 books on UAE culture, history, and the environment as well. Right, so we'll start with Bettany actually, and hopefully Bettany can hear me and she's on the line. Clearly we've had, when you go back into the historical record, there are a number of different evidences from around the world, such as in China and elsewhere, where there have been a lot of mass graves and evidence related to pandemics. But perhaps if you can, Bettany, start us off with Egypt. And I certainly know there's a lot of evidence there that points to something. Perhaps you can just take us through what we think happened from a historical perspective based on the evidence, and really what were the consequences of it.
Absolutely. Just to say how lovely it is to be here with you, even if it's only remotely. I miss being back there. I was last with you in February in 2020 when the pandemic was just starting, and we knew something was coming. But it's lovely that technology allows us to be together. And Rehan, it's such an important question, that because as a historian, obviously I see disease and pandemics and endemics affecting civilizations regularly throughout time, in very bad ways, but also really fascinatingly, there are eventual benefits too. They almost act as a kind of stimulus sometimes for civilization. But you're right to start with ancient Egypt. So if we think back 3,400 years, for instance, to the rule of the pharaoh Amenhotep III, we know that there was a great plague through his reign, and we have his 38-year reign documented with incredible detail on stone engravings that have appeared in Syria. So we can kind of chart the impact of plague on a great civilization like that. And what is so interesting is that it bears incredible similarities to the COVID-19 pandemic that we're all suffering now, in that it seems to have happened and seems to have spread because this was a time when there was an increased amount of international trade. So it was a kind of boom time in ancient Egypt. These were the good times. So there were a lot more boats going out from ports. There was a lot more transfer across borders, a lot more merchants meeting one another. But unfortunately, this means that this plague, they don't know what it is. We think it might possibly be the bubonic plague, was spreading. And again, in very similar ways, it's particularly happening where there are tight groups. So in cities, in military barracks, in temples, in religious groups. But the problem is, and again, very similarly to the effect that we're seeing today, people are traveling from what they think of as infected areas to what they think of as pure areas, and therefore taking the plague with them. And the impact that we see of this in historical terms, a couple of interesting things. One is that there is a lot more focus on the worship of Sekhmet, who was the god of health and healing. So we see Sekhmet is honoured kind of with ever greater ferocity. But also in kind of big game-changing terms, we have, for instance, the son of Amenhotep III was Akhenaten. And Akhenaten, if you know your ancient Egyptian history, will know that Akhenaten completely got rid of all the old gods, starts to worship a single sun god, the Aten, and his son, Tutankhamun, reverses Akhenaten's new plan for the world, and Tutankhamun, as you know, is one of the most famous pharaohs. So we see in that moment actually the impact of the plague, where Akhenaten must have grown up and thought somehow they dishonoured the old gods, or the old gods had left them, and there must be a kind of new solution. That's when we see the worship of one single god, the Aten. So it's just a tiny example, but it shows us how the impact of plagues and pandemics, and the psychological impact of plagues and pandemics and endemics actually shapes the course of history.
Okay, if I can just stay with you, Bethany, actually for the follow-up question. So just let's move through history from Egypt now. Let's move to about the 5th century in Athens. And clearly there was a war going on between the Spartans and the Athenians at the time. And I think Thucydides writes about a plague there, and it may have been a result of the war, but perhaps if you can just talk us through what actually happened there in that particular moment. What does the evidence show?
Again, you're absolutely spot on. So this is the kind of golden age of classical democratic Athens. We're talking the middle of the 5th century BCE, so between 430 and 428 BCE. And Athens is at war with Sparta. And the great leader of Athens, Pericles, sees that the countryside outside Athens is being ravaged. So he has this kind of cunning plan that he's going to keep the population of Athens safe within its walls. So he closes them in. But the problem is that this is a civilization that is now living too close. People are too close by Jowl, and a plague goes through the city. We now know that it's a form of typhus, so we've analysed the interior of the teeth of some of the victims of that plague, so we know exactly what it was. But it was devastating. So in that period, probably 80,000 of the inhabitants of Athens die, and the population at its most is only 200,000. So this is almost half of the population. Thucydides is himself, the great father of history, we know suffered from the plague. He downplays it, but we know that he was a victim and he survived. So he's writing from a point of absolute kind of not just eyewitness experience, but personal experience. But what's really fascinating, this was a terrible, it was devastating, it was very gruesome, it was a horrible way to die. But what is fascinating is that it doesn't actually, it doesn't reduce the moral certainty of Athens that it is going to win this war. And in many ways, there's a cultural flourishing after it. So if you think of a number of the famous Greek tragedies and comedies that are written, some of the beautiful arts that is created, in some ways it becomes a kind of golden time for Athens. So it's almost as if those who didn't die, who physically survived, thought that they then had to meet the world on the front foot, as it were, and we get a second flourishing of what we think of as a so-called golden age classical Athens.
Thank you so much. If I may, so let's go from the 5th century BC, let's go forward about 1,000 years now to around the 500 odd AD. And Peter, if I could address this question to you, because we have a plague at that time, which is known as the Justinian plague. Could you just talk us through, what happens, and also what was the consequence for this region as well? Because I think you've got a view that there was an impact on something that was emerging from this region 100 years later, and due to the Justinian plague as well. In terms of there's a gap.
In summary, I think the result of the Justinian plague was that it completely remade the world of the Middle Eastern Europe. Beforehand, Justinian had been trying to reunify the Roman Empire, coming into Europe. But also, you had the fights with the Sasanians in Persia. The Sasanians and the Byzantines were completely floored. They were flattened by this plague. Millions of people died. One estimate is that in that particular plague as a whole, anything up to 100 million people might have been killed, which is a significant percentage of the regional population, or indeed the global population. But at the end of it, the Roman Empire, based in Byzantium then, was very, very weakened. The Sasanians were weakened. the northern tribes of Europe were able to come down into the peninsula of Italy. And when, shortly afterwards, Islam emerged in the Arabian Peninsula, it wasn't coming up against the strong empires of Byzantium and of Sasanians, but of empires that had already been severely weakened. And I think it's possible to make a case that had that plague not occurred, you would have had much more difficulty as Islamic forces moving out of the peninsula. So beforehand, you had the Sasanian Empire and the Roman Empire, Romans covering the whole of the Mediterranean effectively. But after, you had the emergence of Western Europe, beginnings of Western Europe, modern Western Europe. You had the Byzantines, and you had the new Islamic Empire coming out of Arabia. So the consequence, or a byproduct, of the weakening of those first empires by the plague was the emergence of what became, the modern geographical and geopolitical structure of Europe and the Middle East. So, right. Yes, it was a pretty dramatic change, a fairly significant result.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. And Bethany, if I can just bring you in there, because obviously this plague occurs in a city that you've written extensively about, Constantinople, Istanbul. As you've toured around the city, what are the things that you've sort of discovered that link back to that plague story of Constantinople?
Well, exactly as Peter says, this was a huge global event. I mean, we know that, for instance, you see crop failure as from Ulster in Northern Ireland through to China at this time. And there are two possibilities. One is that there's been a massive volcanic eruption, which has actually polluted the earth and has made people even weaker and more susceptible to the plague. Or again, that the plague is traveling, just physically haven't got enough people to harvest the land. So, I mean, it's an enormous event, as Peter says. And we know that, for instance, at this time, 900 people a day at least are dying in Constantinople, the city that now is Istanbul. Corpses are being put onto boats, so there are these kind of plague ships that are being loaded up with corpses and sent out to the sea because they recognise the danger of having those infected corpses within the city itself. And also, the first time that we see it in Constantinople is in 542 AD, but there are still outbreaks of this same plague right up to finally until 697 AD. So that's 150 years of trauma. And I think what you see, exactly as Peter said, there is this moment in the 6th century where Justinian is the emperor. He has his empress wife Theodora by his side. They're a real power couple. They have this absolute project between them, both to re-establish the power of the old Roman Empire, but also, really fascinatingly, to reform it so that this is an empire where social justice is at its heart. They've converted, they are Christians. And they really do, you can see from the laws that they promote, they're not perfect. I don't want to give the impression that they're absolutely kind of whiter than white, these two, but they are definitely trying to imagine a new kind of world in Constantinople. So they introduce laws that protect single women, that increase the penalties for rape, for instance, that children who are orphaned have the chance to be supported. So there's a real sense of a kind of new social project, but then the plague comes and in a way it destroys that vision. So actually it would have been fascinating to see what would have happened if it hadn't been so struck. And it never quite, although it is a great and powerful city for the centuries after that, up until obviously the Ottoman conquests of 1453, what you don't see within the city is that kind of sense of certainty and purpose that is there at the beginning of the 6th century. And I think we can all understand that now, having lived through this pandemic. It's not just the tragedy of personal loss. It's not just the disruption of economic and cultural and political and agricultural life. It's not just those things. It's, as we were saying before, it's the kind of psychological and moral impact on us as humans, just having this sort of sense that we aren't invincible, that we are matchsticks when it comes to the power of nature, and that can reduce our ambition. So you do see it both in the fabric of Constantinople, but also in the ambition of the city and its rulers going forward.
Okay. Thank you. So I think, Peter, if I can come to you now, in terms of, let's just move forward in time a little bit, turn the wheel of time, about 800 years, and let's come to the big one, which is the Black Death. Could you just talk us through, what actually happens in Europe, and how does Europe change?
Find a couple of figures that I have in front of me, but all the epidemics and pandemics with at least 1 million estimated deaths, the Black Death is way ahead of others, at top of the list, with an estimated 75 to 200 million people died, 30 to 60% of the entire population of Europe. Now, you can look at Black Death in Britain, you can look at it across Europe, and the stories about villages being left empty. But if you could just imagine the devastation that as this pandemic rolled across Europe, it brought the economy to a halt. It changed the nature of the economy, because with less people, those that survived were able to demand more recompense for their work, so it led to significant changes in the social structure, from serfs to peasant farming. It changes economically, it changes politically, and changes also in the way people looked upon the world around them. The situation where half the population is dying. In some villages it will be more than that. Some towns will be more than that, obviously. And people living there looking for explanations of what are the reasons for this. They couldn't work out that it was being carried by fleas on rats. The story, I think, of the Pied Piper of Hamelin leading the people out of Hamelin, that came a little later. So people were looking for answers, looking for explanations. Some do that through religion, some do it by blaming other communities. There was outbreaks of anti-Semitism in Europe at the time, for example. The inability of people to explain what it was that was happening around them, this led to changes in thought. It led to blaming of other communities. Everybody's solid groundings were shaking, and it's quite natural that in that kind of situation, where what you're used to is collapsing around you, and people are dying from causes you really don't understand, that you look for explanations, you look for justifications, and if you can't find an explanation, you've got to look for someone to blame. Okay, or a community to blame, or this is God's punishment, or you're looking for explanations that make some kind of sense, because you have no way of explaining it in a sense that means something to you. Okay? And we see this through other pandemics as well, as I think Bethany knows far better than I do. But the Black Death led to economic change, yes. We still have areas in Britain that I know where they haven't been occupied since that time, the deserted villages. It had an impact that went on not just in those particular years, but the plague of that kind, the bubonic plague, it doesn't just go away. I mean, the rats don't all die. It comes back over a period of decades. It will come back. London used to have plagues, every 20 or 30 years you get an outbreak of plague. They don't disappear. Unlike some other diseases that can eventually evolve, this doesn't. So it's an ongoing process of social change, of the nightmare of having a pandemic, you just don't know what to do about it. You shut people up, you shut them away, you lock them up. And then people don't come out of it. But we see that through history. And when we get on a little further, I'll give some examples of what happened here in the Emirates.
Right.
These things, they're not new. You know, we've seen from Amenhotep III onwards, we've seen the impact of plague and disease of this kind.
Okay, so if I can stay with you, Peter, just for a minute, which is that if we move forward a little bit more, obviously we have in the 15th century, you know, Columbus going off to discover that. I mean, he was trying to find the Great Khan, and they were trying to obviously, you know, combat the Ottoman Empire, which was the superpower of the time, and he discovers the New World. But not so long after that, the Spanish conquistadors arrive in Mexico, and then also later in Peru, or the land of the Incas as well. Could you just talk us through what happened in the Americas once a lot of the Europeans, starting with the conquistadors, and later the British and others who arrived in the Americas, what actually happened to the land as a result?
If you take a disease into a new population, the impact is devastating. In Europe, smallpox had been around for a long time. People with particular weaknesses would have died from smallpox. So the general population had a certain degree of immunity. But when you get into the Americas, where that disease had never reached, there was no natural immunity amongst the native population of the Americas. And so smallpox devastated them. We were talking earlier, I think you said, that over the early years of European arrival in the Americas, 2 million Europeans, 6 million slaves, but 50 million Native Americans died from the disease that was brought with them. Okay? The population of Mexico, in the first 100 years of engagement with Europe, it's estimated that up to 90% of the native population of Mexico died from smallpox and similar related diseases. So the impact of new diseases arriving in communities with no experience of those diseases, no immunity to them, is completely devastating. Obviously happened in what is now the United States as well. And the rate of death amongst the Native Americans, Red Indians if you like, the Native Americans, again, was incredible. And unlike in a lot of other places, there the disease was actually used as a weapon. And it was used by the settlers of North America, recognizing that the Native Americans and the American Indians were susceptible to smallpox. They started to leave smallpox-infected blankets around to infect the Native Americans, who died in their tens of thousands, perhaps their hundreds of thousands, as an early use of biological warfare. Okay? Because again, they had no immunity. If you look at, you look back a bit at the Black Death, Great Plagues in Europe, when that disease first reached Europe, it reached a community that had no immunity, and so it spread. And the initial phase was devastating. Gradually, over time, immunity is built up. But the first arrival of a disease into a community that has no experience of it could wipe out 90% of the population, as it did in Mexico. Right. That's a pretty amazing statistic about the impact.
Yeah, okay. So Bethany, I mean, whilst the Spanish were taking this disease to the Americas and discovering gold and bringing that gold back to Europe and obviously destabilizing the economy there, at the same time the English in Elizabethan England in the 1590s had been sort of excommunicated by the Catholics of Europe. The Elizabethan economy was suffering quite badly at the time. But there's also a plague in around 1592, 1593 in Elizabethan England as well. Just talk us through what happened there, what were the consequences, culturally what was also being said by playwrights like Shakespeare and others as well.
Yes, I mean, absolutely right, spot on. It kind of, again, it synchronizes with Shakespeare and the production of most of his works, and indeed the works of the other Elizabethan playwrights. And I'm just about to say something positive, only so that we have some hope of what can also emerge from these plagues and pandemics. And just to pick up on Peter's point, two things really. One, just to say, absolutely, I mean, it's something we perhaps should have talked about when we're talking about the classical period, is that the acuity with which people, we always imagine, I think, ancient populations to be suspicious and superstitious and to kind of not to understand the world around them. But right from the Bronze Age onwards, military leaders and city leaders and politicians were absolutely aware of the possibilities of biological warfare. And exactly as Peter says, as happens in the Americas, we see in Athens and Sparta and Thebes the use of infected corpses, which are then either put into water supplies or sent over the walls of cities. So plague-infected corpses were used, they were kind of considered the ultimate weapon in ancient warfare. But just to have a moment of positivity, talking about the Black Death, as you say, Peter, this devastating death which almost certainly did kill 200 million souls. Really interestingly, the impacts of that, if you look at a generation or so after the Black Death, for instance, in the UK, actually what you do see is a phoenix emerging from the ashes. So the population is devastated. It's a great leveler, as we've discovered with our own pandemic. You know, social status, money does not protect you from these infections. In fact, they can often go through the wealthier populations, who are often the more mobile through time. But what happens in the UK after the Black Death is, because there are so few people left, you find people who normally haven't had agency, who haven't been able to have any status in society, doing things they would previously not have been able to do. And that is particularly the case with women, and also the case with so-called lower classes, who are suddenly elevated to become scribes and clerks. And we really see from that moment onwards a complete kind of rewriting of the social structure of the UK, somewhere where women are allowed to have a voice, and also, if you like, the birth of the middle class. I love being a historian, because when you're a historian, whatever your niche time frame is, people always claim that to be the birth of everything fantastic. So I remember actually having a conversation once with somebody who said they saw the birth of the middle classes back in the Stone Age, which I find very hard to believe. But I think we do see that in the 14th century in England and elsewhere in Europe. That's accelerated by the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. And suddenly you see women in really interesting roles. You see, as I said, people who would normally not allowed to be literate, there's an increased level of literacy throughout society. So there are some benefits. There's a huge amount of suffering and sorrow, but there are often a generation or so later benefits. In Elizabethan England, you see the benefits straight away. So the theatres are closed down, but there is a flourishing. The playwrights stuck in their garrets start to furiously pen new plays. Shakespeare, for example, as I know you know, Rehan, went with the theatres closed, suddenly all his income dries up, so he has to find a new way to use his brilliant brain to make money. So he pens this extraordinary sort of narrative length poem, Venus and Adonis, which becomes one of the most popular publications of the age. It is republished 16 times within 50 years of its writing. And it was so popular, we hardly have any extant copies, because the original copies have been so thumbed by people reading it. They loved it so much, it's almost kind of crumbled. So there is this injection of energy and that sort of sense that, you know, eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That happens in the cultural sphere as well. So there is an absolute fluorescence and flourishing of cultural output in Elizabethan England. As I said, we also see that in Athens in the 5th century BCE. And I wonder what our cultural flourishing is going to be in 2022 and 2023 if we follow that same pattern.
Okay, thank you. Some hopeful threads there. Peter, can we just draw it now a little bit closer to home, because there was a plague in Abu Dhabi as well in the 18th century, and it's something I didn't know about until you told me about it. So just talk us through that.
There isn't an enormous amount of documentary evidence, but on the island of Delma, which is one of our main pearling centres in the far west of Abu Dhabi, sometime in the middle of the 18th century, smallpox reached Delma, probably with pearl traders who came from India, because the pearls that were fished in that area were then bought by traders that came from India to Delma and then back to Bombay and to be sold on from there. And the stories on the island are that everybody except 15 people, everybody living on the island, who were several hundreds, perhaps into the low thousands, everybody died except for 15 people. And for a while, the island was abandoned. It was repopulated and became an important pearling centre again. But it's not something new. We have traditions here and we have legends here of the impact of disease usually arriving from overseas. In that particular case, it was smallpox. In the 1930s, there was a cholera outbreak that hit most of the Northern Emirates. It didn't hit Abu Dhabi as far as the records go. Thousands of cases. Fortunately, not too many deaths, but thousands of cases of cholera. And it's all very well documented in the British records of the time for the Arabian Gulf ports of the Emirates, Dubai, Sharjah, Ras Al Khaimah, Ajman. Very little coming out of Fujairah, but we know also that it hit Fujairah. And there's a few little tales about what happened that tell us how the people of the time dealt with it and engaged in acts that seem fairly similar today. If you caught cholera, or you were suspected of having cholera in Dubai or Sharjah in the 1930s, you were sent out of the town. You were sent away, out into the desert. You got better, you came back. You didn't get better, well, you just didn't come back, okay? The same is true in Fujairah. People were sent out of the villages and out of the towns, up into the hillsides. Food was taken to them and left there. If they got better, they came back. You excluded people. People were quarantined. They were shut away. Okay? We know quarantine comes from an Italian word. The Venetians and Ragusans developed it against plague. But the idea of shutting people away is several hundred years old, as people realized where the disease was coming from. They didn't understand how it worked, but they knew somehow that it was arriving with people. You shut them away, okay? And that happened here. The reports in the 1930s make it quite clear that the local people understood that the disease had come with visitors from India, seamen, traders, whatever, okay? And so you take precautions, okay? You close off the traffic. You shut down the trade. You stop the movement of boats back and forth. Now we stop the movement of the planes back and forth. But we can look back into Emirati history and find little bits of evidence of how we have dealt with previous pandemics and previous epidemics of disease here. And there's quite a lot of similarity. We understand the diseases more now, but the diseases hit us with greater force because the nature of global communications has moved forward in the last 80, 90 years. But we can still learn lessons. And there's another lesson that applied to the cholera epidemic here in the 1930s. In the 19th century, there was a big cholera outbreak that affected a lot of Europe, also affected Britain, but again, Bethany knows much more about this than I do. But that was deadly, and it caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. But over time, the nature of cholera, or the strains of cholera, have evolved so that no longer does such a great percentage of people die from it. So it was 200 or 300 out of several thousand that died in Dubai in the 1930s. Now, cholera is not as powerful a disease as it was, 150 years ago. Diseases mutate. COVID-19 is already mutating, and we're getting strains that are stronger than the initial ones, but over time it is probable, in medical and biological terms, that they will mutate to something weaker. After all, it's been suggested that the flu epidemic that hit Europe at the end of the 19th century later evolved to become the common cold. So if we look forward from the mess we're in now with COVID-19, perhaps our children will put it down to a little summer's cold 50 years from now. We'll see. Okay. Or they will see, perhaps we won't.
They will see, yes, they will see. So Bethany, on that, in terms of how people have coped with plagues and pandemics in the historical record, could you talk us through a little bit about the role of art, and in terms of art as a therapy almost to help people overcome that?
Yeah, it's fascinating that, isn't it? And I was just thinking as Peter was talking about quarantine, that, obviously quarantine is a medieval word. And actually, if you look at the Black Death, when it hit northern Italy, in Florence, for instance, they instituted a track and trace system. So I love the fact, being a historian is a very humbling thing, because we always think we've come up with great ideas, but actually people often got there centuries, if not thousands of years before. But the role of art is truly fascinating, because I think we will all recognise from our own experience with COVID-19, as soon as it happened, almost as soon as it happened, within days or a week or so of us understanding this was something that really unprecedented, people started to share poetry with one another. They started to share book recommendations. They started to share images of art. Social media influencers started to kind of create new dances on TikTok, for instance. And if you think about it, this is ridiculous, because we're in a time of enormous danger and trauma, and the world's about to collapse, but we will take time out of our day to create art. And that is something that I see right through the human story, going back to not just thousands of years, but tens of thousands of years. So for instance, there's a community who is hit by some form of plague around 40,000 years ago, but they take time out of their day to make flutes out of the thigh bones of vultures. So whether they're doing that to comfort themselves, to create music, whether they're doing it maybe to try to sum up a spirit in a ritual, we don't know. But for them, art is some kind of a solution. And I think that as a species, we both create in a crisis, and we also try to create our way out of a crisis. So that early plague that we were talking about, that's suffered by 5th century Athens, also appears in China at the time of Confucius. And this is when the philosopher Confucius starts to develop music as a form of therapy. And he talks about music. It's kind of cognitive behavioral psychology. He talks about the impact it has and how music has to be used in therapy. So that really is art therapy before we invent the idea. And Rihan, as we've talked about, on this very stage and also in Dubai, we've talked about how in very early Islamic culture, music is used very formally in hospitals. So we know that there are music stages and that there are kind of resident musicians and bands, which is something that carries right the way through from at least the 10th century CE through to at least the 20th century in some places. So art really has a role. And I think, again, I draw comfort from the fact that when this pandemic hit, people started to create and find real value, not just comfort, but real value in art. And that's something we should all remember going forwards, that when the chips are down, we don't turn away from art, we turn to it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so Peter, what do you think are some of the, because we've covered quite a few plagues and pandemics now in our discussion, what are some of the things that were seen before that we're seeing again now, in terms of, I know you want to talk a little about, often fringe ideas that appear, and maybe you can just talk us through some of that.
We've seen quackery before, we're seeing quackery now. and whether that is people advocating the use of alleged cures that have no medical basis for them whatsoever. Of course, that's happened in the past, okay? And in a way, I think you can understand it in the past because out of desperation, out of frustration, out of ignorance, if there was not sufficient medical knowledge for the supposed doctors to be able to cure you, of course you're going to grasp at straws, you know. Today there's less excuse for that because the medical knowledge is available, and still we have the quackery. And we have the former President of the United States advocating that people take something that can actually kill them, okay? And people believed him, and they actually did it, okay? So we've had quackery in the past. We have quackery now that has less of a reasonable explanation for why it should exist, okay? To search when you are completely ignorant and the world around you is ignorant for anything to save you, that's understandable. To do that in the modern world where there is medical science that will tell us actually what might work and what might not, I think that is less understandable. In the past we've had people turning to religion as, you know, providing an explanation and as a way out. We still have that today. So that in India now, for example, suffering under, you know, a really critical current phase of COVID, people still believe, or a lot of people still believe, that if they take a dip in the Ganges, this will protect them. That is medically not a sound belief, but it is believed by, probably by hundreds of millions of people, because as they don't understand the disease, they will look to a belief, a religious belief, to explain either where it came from or why it was sent and what can be done, what it can do to provide them with a protection against the disease. Okay? And that we see today. I'm sure we see it under Pharaoh Amenhotep III as well, and throughout the course of history, people will turn to religion in time of strife, in times of desperation, in times of the world around them that they know disintegrating in front of their eyes. Yep. And of course that is going to happen. So yes, we've had religion in the past, and we have it now. We have quackery in the past, and we have it now. What I hope that we had it a bit in the past, I hope we'll have it more now, and that is for the future, which is a recording of what actually happened, what people think, what people wrote, what their ideas were, how they suffered. In my home island of Jersey, right at the beginning of the pandemic, Jersey Heritage, which is the heritage body, started inviting people to record things and to write it down. Anything, notes about the day, what they did, what they wrote, what they read, pictures, drawings, anything, to create an island archive of the COVID pandemic. And you know, that archive is building up slowly, and some will be online and some will be physical bits of paper and paintings and everything else. And I hope that that will be happening all over the world, because when it comes to the future betterness, we've got to look into all this. They won't just be transcribing a few stone documents or some tattered pieces of Venetian manuscript, but there'll be an enormous archive that will help people in the future to understand how we have responded. You know, how the people of 2020 and 2021 have responded to a pandemic. It should be possible in the future for an understanding of this pandemic to be the deepest understanding so far, because there's more data available.
Sure.
I wish we had the data from the 18th century smallpox epidemic on Delma. We don't have it, okay? So we have to guess, we have to make assumptions. And the same with other pandemics much earlier in the past. This pandemic will be the best recorded so far, and for learning lessons from it, and for future historians, I think that's of absolutely fundamental importance.
Yeah. So Bethany, if I could just actually direct the same question to you about the parallels between past pandemics and the current one, and just picking up on some of that, you know, whether we call it quackery or conspiracy theories or the rise of religion and so on. Could you just maybe just pull a few of those strands together and some of the things that you've seen, what some of those other parallels might be?
Well, again, exactly as Peter says, there is definitely an increase in belief in religion of whatever kind. So both of kind of new unorthodox forms of religion and orthodox forms of religion at the time of a pandemic or a plague. You see that without exception in all the cultures and civilizations we've been talking about. Another parallel, though, and again, I'm obviously the kind of woman on the panel with the hope hat on, but another parallel which is rather joyful is that from Thucydides' accounts of the plague in 5th century Athens, for instance, the account of the plague that we've been describing in Constantinople in the 6th century AD. One of the things that Thucydides records and then that doctors and surgeons record in Constantinople is that a huge number of mortalities come from those who have been caring for those who are sick. And I know this is a very obvious thing to say, but that shows us that there were healthy women and men who gave up their lives in order to care for the ill, and not just for families, but we know that there is a kind of call out, in effect, to key workers in both of those cities to say that we have this crisis, what can you do to help? And that they came and that they then gave up their lives. And that's something that I think we're all acutely aware of in the 21st century. And I just want to say thank you to them, whoever's watching, and while this event is being recorded, because the extraordinary self-sacrifice that has come, that we've seen in every single continent, of people who've just put on their medical uniforms, put on some PPE, often gone in even without PPE to help others, has just been remarkable. But as I said, that is something that we see in the historical record, and also excitingly that I see in the bone evidence archaeologically through time. So I've just been filming in Gibraltar. We were talking about the impact of the plague. I'm actually supposed to be in Istanbul now, and I can't be because for quarantine reasons. And I've just been filming in Gibraltar, and we were looking at the extraordinary evidence of Neanderthal communities that they have there. And even with those Neanderthal communities, we know that they are staying behind and looking after their elderly and their sick. So that is something that's a constant response to plague, which is again a hopeful and an uplifting one. We don't put them all on plague ships and send them out and just wait for them to die. We roll up our sleeves and try to save their lives.
Okay, no, thank you. I think one last question from me to both of you, really, which is, and maybe Bethany, I can start with you, which is really, what do you think are some of the lessons that we can learn from the ancient world with regards our time? And, you know, whether it's messages of hope or whatever it might be, just any kind of last few hopeful words, hopefully, from you.
Well, I think, you know, what we know is that memory matters, that we are creatures of memory, that we carry memory right across our brains, and we should never deny the past. So actually we can learn from history by looking back at the past responses to those pandemics. We now know that we can't have a future idea unless we access a memory or an idea, an experience of some kind from the past. So in some senses, it's a reminder both to look forward to what science and technology can do, but also to look back. And I think that there's, you know, there is a kind of philosophical point here that when we live in cities, we are at risk. We know that as soon as city dwelling starts, we get an increase in pandemic outbreaks, we get an increase in crime, we get an increase in antisocial behaviour. That is something that comes from living together. Somebody once said to me rather brilliantly, we talk about all roads lead to Rome. They said, actually, we should say all pathogens lead to Rome from the great city. So cities cause trouble, but they also force us to. And as soon as we have city dwellers, we have and poets who talk about the only way that we can live together productively is to be aware of those around us. And Socrates, Confucius and the Buddha all say basically the same thing, that all that matters, and I'm going to sound very cliched here, is that we love those around us. And that if we do that, everything else will fall into its place. So I think this pandemic has taught us both how connected we are across space, absolutely, across international borders and boundaries, but also across time. And it's reminded me that nothing matters other than love.
No, thank you, Bethany. So a real message of compassion and love. And Peter, same question to you, really. What are some of the lessons from the past that we could, use to help us get us out of this one?
Well, the first lesson is it does come to an end.
Okay,
it does not go on forever. And there's a lesson also that with advancing medical knowledge advances over time. People learn more. And as people learn more, the precautions you need to take become more apparent. The protective measures, the way of treating things, it evolves with time. And that will come with this epidemic and a pandemic and the one that comes next, whatever that is. Okay. I would agree with Bethany. It tells us something about who we are. It tells us something about city living. It tells us something about the care we need to take, not just of other human beings, but of the environment. And it seems to be that this particular pandemic, like some previous ones, have come about because of a jumping of disease from animals to man, the zoonotic transfer. Whether engineered or not, there has been a jumping of this particular virus from animals into man. We have to be careful about what we do with the environment. We have to protect the environment, study it, but to understand that the environment and nature, just like the weather and just like the sea, is something that can always take us unawares and can always cause problems that we alone are not capable of resolving or facing. And that is part of the human experience. It has been from the first plagues, it has been from the Neanderthals onwards, that we cannot control everything there is around us. However arrogant we may get, however much we may believe that we can control what happens in the world, Mother Nature and everything in it makes us look insignificant in space and in time. And one advantage of being involved in history or in archaeology is, and I think again Bethany would agree, is it makes us realize how utterly unimportant we now are, because there's everything that came before us that led up to what there is today. And all we can do is to try to make sure there's something decent to hand on to those who are here tomorrow.
Good. Well, thank you so much. I think that's kind of hopefully given everyone a bit of a canter, a race through a number of different plagues over a historical kind of time frame. Hopefully it's also been some messages which have been quite hopeful about reaching out, about showing love, about showing compassion, about art also flourishing during this time, and also very much more about having a stewardship for the environment and the ecology and really taking care about that. So I think with that I'm going to call the session to a close, and I'd like to really thank the Arabic Language Centre for organising the book fair, the AV team and the volunteers. I'd very, very much like to thank Bethany, who's obviously joined us remotely. Would love to have you back in the Emirates at some point, but big round of applause for Bethany, who's joined us remotely. And also big thank you to Peter as well, so who had a bit of a bad back this morning, but kind of soldiered in, and thank you very much. Big round of applause for Peter as well. Thank you, and good evening.